I was standing at the ATM when my world tilted sideways. The screen showed $17.32 in my checking account. I stared at those numbers until they blurred, certain the machine had made an error. My pension deposit was supposed to be there, $1,412 that should have arrived 3 days ago, just like it had every month for the past 6 years. The receipt crumpled in my trembling hand as I walked back to my car, that old Honda that David always said I should replace. "You deserve something nicer, Mom," he'd say, patting my shoulder with the same gentle touch he'd used as a boy when he wanted extra cookies before dinner. "Let me help you look at cars this weekend." But weekend after weekend passed, and somehow we never made it to the dealership. There was always something more pressing: his work, his girlfriend's family barbecue, a golf tournament he couldn't miss. I stopped bringing it up, the way you stop mentioning a leaky faucet when no one seems to hear the dripping anymore. At home, I spread my bank statements across the kitchen table where David and I used to do his homework, where I'd helped him practice multiplication tables and write book reports about heroes who always saved the day. The papers felt thin between my fingers, fragile as tissue, but the truth they revealed was solid as stone. 3 withdrawals, each one for exactly my monthly pension amount. Each one dated the day after my deposit cleared. Each one authorized by someone with access to my account, someone I trusted completely. My hands found my phone before my mind caught up with what I was doing. David answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar, the same voice that used to call me from college every Sunday evening to tell me about his classes and ask what I was cooking for dinner. "Hey, Mom, how are you feeling today? You sounded tired yesterday." The concern in his voice made me hesitate. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe the bank had made an error. Maybe someone had stolen my information. Maybe my 68-year-old mind was missing something obvious that my 34-year-old son would understand immediately. "David, honey, I'm looking at my bank account and something's wrong. My pension money isn't there. It shows withdrawals I didn't make." I tried to keep my voice steady, normal, the way I'd trained myself to sound whenever I called with what might be perceived as complaints or neediness. Silence stretched across the phone line like a held breath. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted from warmth to something else. Irritation, maybe, or the weary patience adults use with confused elderly relatives. "Mom, we talked about this. Remember? You asked me to help manage your finances because you were worried about making mistakes. You signed the papers at the bank so I could help you." His words came faster now, overlapping each other in their hurry to fill the uncomfortable pause. "You said you trusted me to make sure your bills got paid and everything was handled properly." I searched my memory like rifling through an old jewelry box, looking for something specific among tangled necklaces and forgotten earrings. Had we talked about this? Had I signed something? The harder I tried to remember, the more uncertain I became. The way you doubt whether you locked the front door once someone plants the seed of worry. "But David, the money's just gone. All of it. I only have $17 left." "That's not possible, Mom. I've been very careful with your account. Maybe you're looking at the wrong statements, or maybe you made some purchases you forgot about. You know how you sometimes buy things and don't remember?" His voice carried that gentle condescension that adult children use when their parents start showing signs of aging, real or imagined. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing closer while I sat surrounded by evidence that contradicted everything my son was telling me. The bank statements didn't lie, but David's voice held such certainty, such calm authority, that I began to question what my own eyes were showing me. "Are you eating enough, Mom? Sometimes when you don't eat regularly, your memory gets fuzzy. Remember what the doctor said about keeping your blood sugar stable?" His words carried the weight of expertise, the confidence of someone who'd always been good with numbers and logic and solving problems that confused other people. I'd been so proud when he graduated with his business degree, when he got promoted to management, when he bought his first house with the girl he'd been dating since college. "Maybe you should lie down for a bit," he continued, his voice softening back to the gentle tone I remembered from childhood bedtime stories. "I'll come by tomorrow and we'll look at everything together, okay? We'll get it all sorted out." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen as evening light faded through windows that needed cleaning, staring at bank statements that told a story I didn't want to believe. The house felt too quiet, too big for one person, filled with the echoes of conversations and laughter from when David still visited regularly, when he still called just to chat, when I still felt essential to his happiness instead of like an obligation he managed between more important responsibilities. If you like emotional stories, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here. And tell me, from which city are you watching? I made myself a cup of tea with hands that had started shaking again, not from fear, but from something deeper, the slow recognition that the person I trusted most in the world might be the person hurting me most deeply. The tea tasted like nothing, like water flavored with disappointment and confusion, while outside my kitchen window, the neighborhood settled into its evening routine of families coming home to each other, of dinners cooking and children being called inside before dark. Tomorrow, David would come with his explanations and his gentle concern for my failing memory. Tomorrow, he would sit at this same table and help me understand why I was wrong about what I was seeing, why my confusion was natural and expected, and nothing to worry about as long as he was there to take care of everything. But tonight, in the growing darkness of my empty house, I allowed myself to wonder if my son had been lying to me for months. David arrived the next afternoon with his girlfriend Sarah, both of them dressed like they were stopping by on their way to somewhere more important. She wore that crisp white blouse that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and he carried his leather portfolio like armor against whatever unpleasantness awaited him in his mother's outdated kitchen. "Mom, you look tired," were his first words, delivered with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating a problem that needed managing. No hug, no genuine inquiry about my well-being, just the efficient observation of a busy man who wanted to resolve this situation quickly and move on with his day. Sarah smiled at me with the practiced politeness of someone who'd been coached on how to interact with difficult elderly relatives. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson. David mentioned you've been having some confusion about your finances. That must be so stressful for you." They sat across from me at my own kitchen table, like investigators interviewing a suspect, their body language suggesting patience that had limits. David opened his portfolio and pulled out documents I'd never seen before, spreading them across the surface with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Here's what happened, Mom," he began, his finger tracing lines of text that might as well have been written in a foreign language. "You gave me power of attorney 6 months ago. Remember? You were worried about paying bills on time, making sure everything was handled properly." I stared at the signature on the bottom of the legal document, trying to recognize my own handwriting in the careful loops and lines that spelled out my name. The signature looked right, felt familiar, but I couldn't recall the conversation that led to it, couldn't remember feeling worried about my ability to manage my own finances. "I don't remember being confused about bills," I said carefully, knowing my words would be interpreted as further evidence of my declining mental state. "I've been paying my own bills for 40 years. Sarah exchanged a look with David, one of those quick glances that married couples use to communicate without words. In that brief moment, I saw myself through their eyes, a confused old woman clinging to independence she could no longer handle, too proud to admit she needed help, but too scattered to function without it. "Mom, you called me 3 times last month asking if you'd paid your electric bill," David said, with the weary patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. "You couldn't remember if you'd written the check or not. You were so worried about it that you lost sleep." Had I called him about that? The memory felt slippery, uncertain, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Maybe I had been worried. Maybe my aging mind was playing tricks on me in ways I hadn't recognized or wanted to acknowledge. "And you asked me to help you figure out your bank statements because the numbers weren't adding up right," he continued, warming to his theme now, building his case with the confidence of someone who'd practiced this explanation. "You said you felt like you were losing track of things and it scared you." Each word he spoke painted a picture of an incompetent woman who couldn't be trusted with her own money, her own decisions, her own life. The worst part was that I couldn't definitively prove he was lying. My memory, sharp as it had always been, suddenly felt unreliable under the weight of his certainty. "Where is my pension money going?" I asked, trying to focus on the concrete facts rather than the shifting ground of disputed memories. "The bank statements show withdrawals I didn't make. It's going into your savings account, Mom. A high-interest savings account that will help your money grow instead of just sitting there earning nothing." David's tone suggested this should be obvious, that any reasonable person would appreciate having their money managed more efficiently. "I want to see that savings account," I said, hearing my own voice sound smaller than I intended, less authoritative than a woman should sound when discussing her own finances. "Of course," Sarah interjected smoothly, her voice carrying the kind of professional reassurance I imagined she used at her job in human resources. But remember, savings accounts take time to show growth. It's not like checking accounts where you see immediate deposits. This is long-term planning for your security. David nodded approvingly at his girlfriend's explanation, and I felt suddenly outnumbered in my own home, outmaneuvered by people who spoke in financial terms I'd never needed to understand when my husband was alive, when life was simpler, and money was something you earned, saved, and spent without requiring advanced degrees to comprehend. "I want to go to the bank with you next week," I said, surprised by my own boldness. "I want to see this savings account for myself." Another quick glance passed between them, and David sighed with the resigned frustration of someone dealing with an unreasonable demand. "Mom, we can't just walk into a bank and demand to see accounts. There are procedures, privacy laws, appointment requirements. It's not like it used to be when you could just chat with the teller about your business." His words made me feel ancient, out of touch, like someone who didn't understand how the modern world operated. When had banking become so complicated that a woman couldn't visit her own accounts? When had I become too old and confused to handle the basic transactions I'd been managing since before David was born? "Why don't we start with something simple?" Sarah suggested, her voice taking on the gentle tone people use with children and invalids. "Let's make sure you're eating properly, taking your medications on schedule, keeping up with your doctor's appointments. Sometimes when we don't take care of our basic health, everything else feels overwhelming." They stayed for another hour, during which they reorganized my kitchen cabinets more efficiently, suggested I might benefit from a house cleaning service I couldn't afford, and recommended I consider moving somewhere smaller and more manageable, maybe one of those nice senior communities where you'd have people your own age to talk to. When they finally left, David kissed my forehead with the distant affection of someone fulfilling a duty. "Try not to worry about the financial stuff, Mom. I've got it all under control. That's why I'm here, to take care of things you don't need to stress about anymore." Through my front window, I watched them walk to David's car, their heads bent together in conversation I couldn't hear but could easily imagine. They looked like a successful young couple discussing practical solutions to an elderly relative's declining capabilities, their faces serious with the burden of managing someone who could no longer manage herself. Sarah's hand rested on David's arm as they talked, a gesture of support and solidarity that made it clear I was the problem they were solving together, the challenge they were facing as a team. In that moment, I realized I had become an obligation rather than a mother, a burden rather than a blessing, something to be managed efficiently rather than loved unconditionally. The house felt different after they left, smaller, sadder, filled with the lingering scent of Sarah's expensive perfume and the echo of David's professional patience. I sat in my living room surrounded by furniture I'd chosen and paid for, in a house I'd lived in for 30 years, feeling like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome in her own life. The following week, I decided to make David's favorite meal, the beef stew with carrots and potatoes that he used to request for every birthday dinner when he was small. I spent the morning at the grocery store, carefully counting dollars and comparing prices, stretching my remaining $17 to cover ingredients that would create something special, something that might remind him of the mother he used to love without conditions or complications. I called him Tuesday morning to invite him over for dinner Thursday evening. "I'm making your beef stew," I told him, hearing my own voice carry more hope than dignity. "The one with the herbs you always said was better than anything in restaurants." "That sounds nice, Mom, but Thursday's no good. Sarah and I are having dinner with her parents. They're helping us look at investment properties." His voice carried the distracted tone of someone scrolling through emails while talking. "Maybe another time. What about Friday then? Or this weekend?" "This weekend's packed. Sarah's company retreat is Saturday, and Sunday we're playing golf with the Hendersons. You remember the Hendersons, right? Tom works with me at the firm. Really good connections there." The way he said, "really good connections," made it clear that beef stew with his aging mother didn't qualify as valuable networking. I was an obligation that competed with opportunity, a sentimental waste of time that successful people learn to manage efficiently. "Of course, honey. Maybe next week then." "Sure, Mom. Next week." But I made the stew anyway, cooking it slowly the way my mother had taught me, browning the meat carefully and adding vegetables at precisely the right moments. the kitchen filled with rich, familiar smells that transported me back to years when cooking for David meant nourishing someone who appreciated the love stirred into every pot, someone who cleaned his plate and asked for seconds and told me I was the best cook in the world. I packaged half the stew in containers that fit easily in David's refrigerator, adding handwritten notes with reheating instructions and suggestions for what bread might go well with it. Then I drove to his house, that beautiful 2-story colonial in the subdivision where young professionals lived behind manicured lawns and 3-car garages. Sarah answered the door in yoga clothes that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill. Her smile was polite but strained, the expression of someone interrupted during private time by an unexpected visitor who didn't understand appropriate boundaries. "Mrs. Patterson, how nice to see you." Her voice carried the careful courtesy of someone who'd been taught never to be openly rude to elderly relatives, no matter how inconvenient their timing. "David's not here right now. He's at the gym." "I brought beef stew," I said, holding up the containers like an offering that might purchase my welcome. "His favorite recipe. I thought you might enjoy it too." "That's so thoughtful," Sarah said, accepting the containers without inviting me inside. Through the open doorway, I could see their living room with its expensive furniture and carefully arranged decorative objects, a space designed for entertaining people who mattered rather than accommodating family members who didn't. "Could I maybe come in for just a minute? Use your bathroom before I drive home?" Something flickered across Sarah's face. Irritation, maybe, or the kind of resigned patience people show when asked to accommodate requests they can't politely refuse. "Of course. Just through there." Their bathroom was larger than my bedroom, appointed with fixtures that gleamed like jewelry and towels so fluffy they looked like they'd never been used. Everything coordinated perfectly, from the soap dispenser to the artwork on the walls, creating an environment of effortless luxury that made my own modest home feel shabby by comparison. When I emerged, Sarah was waiting by the front door with my empty containers already washed and ready for my departure. The efficiency of her hospitality made it clear this visit had lasted exactly as long as politeness required, and not a moment longer. "Please tell David I stopped by," I said, accepting the containers that had been returned so quickly they were still warm from hot water. "Absolutely. He'll be so sorry he missed you." But when I called David the next day to ask if he'd enjoyed the stew, he seemed genuinely surprised. "Stew? What stew, Mom?" "The beef stew I dropped off yesterday. Sarah said she'd tell you." A pause, then the sound of muffled conversation, David's hand covering the phone while he consulted with Sarah about something I couldn't quite hear. When he came back on the line, his voice carried a note of gentle concern that felt more patronizing than caring. "Mom, are you sure you brought stew to our house? Sarah doesn't remember anyone stopping by yesterday. Maybe you took it somewhere else and forgot where." The ground shifted beneath me again, reality becoming negotiable in ways that left me questioning my own experience. Had I imagined the conversation with Sarah? Had I driven somewhere else entirely and confused the houses, the people, the entire interaction? "I spoke to Sarah," I insisted, but my voice lacked conviction now, weakened by the persistent suggestion that my memory couldn't be trusted. "She answered your door. She took the containers. Sarah's been home all day working on her presentation for the company retreat. She would have mentioned if you'd stopped by." David's tone carried the patient concern of someone dealing with an elderly relative's increasing confusion. "Maybe you drove by the house thinking about visiting, and it felt so real that your mind filled in the rest." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the clean containers that proved I'd made stew, that proved I'd driven somewhere to deliver it, that proved I'd had a conversation with someone who'd accepted my offering. The containers were real, tangible, impossible to explain away as confused memory or wishful thinking. Yet David's certainty, his calm authority, made me doubt what I knew to be true. How could I be so sure of events that the other participants claimed never happened? Was my aging mind playing elaborate tricks on me, creating detailed false memories that felt completely authentic? The next Sunday, I decided to attend the church service at David's congregation, the modern evangelical church where he and Sarah had become active members, where they volunteered for youth programs and participated in couples' Bible studies. I'd visited a few times over the years, always feeling somewhat out of place among the younger families and professional couples who formed the core of the community. I arrived early and chose a seat near the back, hoping to catch David's attention when he entered. The sanctuary filled gradually with families who greeted each other with the easy familiarity of people who shared not just faith, but social circles, professional networks, common interests that extended far beyond Sunday morning worship. David and Sarah arrived 15 minutes before the service began, walking down the center aisle with the confidence of people who belonged, who were known and valued by this community. They took seats in the third row, their usual spot among other young couples who served on committees and hosted dinner parties and planned charitable fundraising events. During the meet and greet portion of the service, I made my way forward to where David stood talking with a man I recognized as his supervisor from work. The conversation seemed important, intense, focused on business matters that wouldn't welcome interruption from family concerns. I waited politely for a pause, then stepped forward with the careful smile I'd perfected for approaching my son in public settings. "Hello, David." He looked at me with genuine surprise, as if I were a casual acquaintance who'd appeared unexpectedly, rather than his mother who'd driven 30 minutes to attend his church. "Mom, I didn't know you were here today. I thought it would be nice to worship together," I said, aware that the conversation around us had paused while people assessed this family interaction. "Maybe we could sit together for the rest of the service? We're kind of settled where we are," David said, glancing back at Sarah, who was deep in conversation with several other women about some committee meeting I wouldn't understand or be able to contribute to meaningfully. "And there's not really room in our row." His supervisor, a man named Gary, whom I'd met at David's promotion celebration last year, extended his hand with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Patterson, isn't it? David's mentioned how proud he is of your independence. Still living on your own, managing everything yourself. That's impressive at your age." The comment felt like praise wrapped around an insult, acknowledging my autonomy while emphasizing my age as something remarkable to overcome. David nodded approvingly, as if my continued existence in my own home was a personal accomplishment that reflected well on his character as a son. "She's doing great," David agreed, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone describing a challenging situation he was managing successfully. "Very self-sufficient. We hardly have to worry about her at all." The service began before I could respond, and I found myself returning to my seat in the back, while David remained surrounded by his chosen community of successful, attractive people who shared his values and ambitions. During the final hymn, I watched him sing with obvious joy, his arm around Sarah's waist, their faces lifted toward heaven with the confidence of people who believed God favored their choices and blessed their prosperity. They left through the side door immediately after the service ended, moving quickly toward whatever Sunday afternoon plans awaited them. I saw them in the parking lot, laughing with friends about something I couldn't hear, their body language suggesting the easy satisfaction of people whose lives were unfolding exactly as they'd planned. I drove home in silence, understanding with devastating clarity that I had become an embarrassment my son managed rather than a mother he celebrated. The phone stopped ringing after that Sunday at church, not because David had disconnected it, but because I stopped making the calls that had become exercises in polite rejection. No more invitations to dinner that competed with more important social obligations. No more offers to help with household projects that Sarah had already hired professionals to handle. No more attempts to insert myself into a life that had moved beyond needing me. I developed new routines that didn't depend on anyone else's schedule or availability. Tuesday mornings at the library, where I could sit among strangers who didn't know I'd become irrelevant to the person I'd loved most. Thursday afternoons at the community center, attending lectures about topics that interested no one but me: local history, gardening techniques, managing grief after losing a spouse. The grief counselor, a gentle woman named Linda who led the weekly support group, asked each of us to bring a photograph that represented what we missed most about our former lives. The other widows brought wedding pictures, family vacation snapshots, images of their deceased husbands at various stages of their marriages. I brought a photo of David at age 8, gap-toothed and grinning, his arms wrapped around my neck after I'd surprised him by attending his school play. His costume was wrinkled and his stage makeup smeared, but his joy was absolute and unconditional. In that moment, captured by my old film camera, I was the most important person in his universe. "Tell us about this photo," Linda said during our circle time, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone trained to navigate emotional minefields. "This is my son," I said, running my finger along the edge of the picture where time had begun to curl the corners. This was taken when he still needed me. The other women nodded with understanding that went beyond words. They knew about children who grew up and away, about love that became inconvenient rather than essential, about the particular loneliness of being forgotten by someone you could never forget. At home, I began eating dinner standing at the kitchen counter, too exhausted by solitude to set the table for one person. The evening news provided background noise that filled the silence, but demanded no response, no conversation, no effort to appear engaged with life beyond my own shrinking world. My refrigerator gradually emptied as I lost interest in cooking meals no one would share or appreciate. Cereal for dinner became normal. Crackers and cheese counted as balanced nutrition. The elaborate meal planning that had once structured my weeks gave way to the minimum effort required for survival. The savings account David had mentioned remained a mystery I lacked the energy to investigate. Each month my pension disappeared, transferred to some high-interest investment that generated no statements I could access, no evidence of growth I could verify. I lived on the small Social Security payment that barely covered utilities and basic groceries, rationing resources with the careful precision of someone whose margin for error had disappeared entirely. But I wasn't as helpless as David believed. During 43 years of marriage to his father, I'd learned that women needed secrets, small financial refuges that belonged to them alone. Robert had been a good husband and provider, but he'd also been a man of his generation who believed wives shouldn't worry about complicated financial matters that might overwhelm their delicate sensibilities. So I'd developed the habit of saving small amounts from the household grocery budget, $5 here, $10 there, money squirreled away in a coffee can hidden behind cleaning supplies in the basement laundry room. Over the decades, those modest savings had grown into something substantial, a nest egg that Robert never knew existed and that David had never thought to look for. The coffee can contained more than money. It held the deed to my house, purchased with my inheritance from my mother, and kept in my name alone, despite Robert's suggestions that joint ownership would be more convenient for tax purposes. It contained documentation of the life insurance policy I'd maintained independently, paying premiums from my secret savings account that no bank statements would reveal to casual examination. Most importantly, it contained copies of every financial document David had ever asked me to sign, including the power of attorney agreement that I'd photographed with my phone before signing. Suspicious even then of the terms I didn't fully understand, but unwilling to admit my ignorance to a son who already questioned my mental capabilities. The power of attorney was limited in scope, designed to allow David to pay bills and manage routine financial transactions. It specifically excluded access to my primary residence, my life insurance benefits, and any assets held in my name alone. The lawyer who'd drafted the document had been thorough in protecting my interests, even though David's hasty explanations had made it seem like a simple administrative convenience. Late one evening, after another day of silence from the son who'd once called me every day just to hear my voice, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing these documents by lamplight. The numbers told a different story than the one David had been crafting for my consumption. His careful manipulation of my finances was legal within the narrow boundaries of the power of attorney, but it left him vulnerable to questions about where my money was actually going and whether his management truly served my best interests. The basement where I'd hidden my emergency funds felt different now, not like a desperate hiding place, but like a strategic command center where I could plan my next moves without interference from people who'd convinced themselves they knew what was best for me. The coffee can sat heavy in my hands, filled with evidence of a life more carefully planned than anyone suspected. I'd been poor before David was born, back when Robert and I were newlyweds struggling to establish ourselves in careers that demanded patience and persistence. I knew how to stretch dollars, how to find resources others overlooked, how to survive on less than anyone thought possible. Those skills hadn't disappeared with age. They'd simply been overshadowed by years of relative comfort and security that David had mistaken for helplessness. The photo from grief counseling sat propped against my kitchen window, 8-year-old David's arms wrapped around a mother he'd adored without reservation or calculation. That little boy had loved me for the stories I told, the songs I sang, the way I made ordinary days feel magical through attention and creativity and unconditional devotion. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being magical and started being manageable. I'd allowed myself to become a problem that required solving rather than a person who deserved respect. I'd accepted the role of confused elderly woman whose opinions didn't matter and whose independence was an illusion maintained through other people's patience and charity. But sitting there in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my own careful planning and hidden resources, I felt something stir that I hadn't experienced in months. Not anger exactly, and not revenge. Something cleaner and more powerful. The slow recognition of my own worth, my own capabilities, my own right to exist on my own terms, rather than according to someone else's convenience. The coffee can went back to its hiding place, but I kept one document on my kitchen table, the original power of attorney with its careful limitations and specific exclusions. Tomorrow I would make some phone calls to people who might find those limitations very interesting indeed. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. They had no idea that the confused old woman they'd been managing so efficiently had been 3 steps ahead of them from the very beginning, protecting herself in ways they'd never thought to look for. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, sounds of a structure that had sheltered me for decades and would continue to do so long after David realized that his assumptions about my vulnerability had been as misguided as his assumptions about my love. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not from insomnia, but from something that felt like anticipation. For the first time in months, I had purpose beyond simply surviving another day of polite invisibility. I made coffee in my favorite mug, the one with the small chip that Sarah would have thrown away for being imperfect, and sat at my kitchen table watching dawn break over the neighborhood where I'd raised my son. I remembered the woman I used to be before marriage taught me to minimize my opinions. Before motherhood taught me to prioritize everyone else's needs above my own. Before widowhood taught me to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention anyone chose to offer. That younger woman had been decisive, resourceful, unafraid to advocate for herself when circumstances demanded action rather than patience. She'd been the one who'd negotiated with contractors when we'd bought this house, catching errors in estimates that Robert had been ready to accept without question. She'd been the one who'd researched David's schools, interviewed teachers, fought for accommodations when he'd struggled with reading in 2nd grade. She'd managed our household budget with mathematical precision that would have impressed the business degree David was so proud of earning. Somewhere along the way, I'd allowed that competent woman to fade into the background, replaced by the accommodating wife, the self-sacrificing mother, the grateful widow who didn't want to burden anyone with her own needs or opinions. I'd become so practiced at making myself smaller that I'd forgotten I'd ever been large enough to take up space in the world. But sitting there with documents spread before me like battle plans, I felt her stirring back to life. The woman who'd once been capable of protecting herself and the people she loved. The woman who'd saved money without being asked, planned for contingencies without being instructed, made decisions without requiring permission from anyone who thought they knew better. I spent the morning researching elder law attorneys, reading reviews and credentials with the thoroughness I'd once applied to selecting David's pediatricians and summer camps. The internet, which David assumed was beyond my comprehension, revealed resources I'd never known existed. Legal aid societies, advocacy groups, financial counseling services designed specifically for people in my situation. The lawyer I called first, Margaret Chen, had a voice that projected competence without condescension. When I explained my circumstances, she didn't interrupt with suggestions that I might be confused or mistaken. She took notes, asked specific questions about documentation, and scheduled an appointment for that same afternoon. Bring copies of everything, she instructed. Bank statements, the power of attorney agreement, any correspondence you've had with financial institutions. And Mrs. Patterson, you were smart to keep your own records. That's going to make this much easier. Smart? When was the last time someone had called me smart instead of confused, organized instead of scattered, prepared instead of helpless? Margaret Chen's words fell into the empty spaces in my chest, like seeds finding fertile soil after a long drought. Her office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house, with parking that didn't require navigating confusing garage structures and hallways that felt residential rather than intimidatingly corporate. Margaret herself was a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed but approachably human, with reading glasses that she put on and took off while reviewing my documents. "Your son has been very careful to stay within legal boundaries," she said after studying the power of attorney for several minutes. But that doesn't mean his actions serve your best interests. Moving your entire pension to an account you can't access isn't necessarily what this document authorizes him to do. She spread my bank statements across her desk like a detective examining evidence, her finger tracing the pattern of deposits and withdrawals that told the story of systematic financial isolation. Has he provided you with statements from this savings account he mentioned? Any documentation showing where your money is actually going? He says it's earning high interest, that I wouldn't understand the complicated investment terms. He says it's better for me not to worry about details that might confuse me. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened. Mrs. Patterson, you understand that your money being moved to accounts you can't monitor or access isn't protecting you from confusion. It's preventing you from exercising your legal rights as the account owner. Her words cut through months of gaslighting with surgical precision. David hadn't been protecting me from financial stress. He'd been protecting himself from financial scrutiny. The complexity he claimed was beyond my comprehension wasn't too advanced for my aging mind. It was too questionable for honest examination. What are my options? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, how much it resembled the tone I'd used years ago when advocating for David's educational needs or negotiating with insurance companies after Robert's death. Several. We can demand full accounting of where your money has been invested, require your son to provide documentation of all transactions made under the power of attorney, and if necessary, revoke his authority entirely. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying my face for signs of the uncertainty that had paralyzed me for months. The question is whether you're prepared for the family conflict this might create. Family conflict. The phrase that had kept me silent through months of diminishing resources and increasing isolation. The fear that had made me accept unacceptable treatment rather than risk losing what little connection remained with my only child. But what connection was I actually preserving? David's monthly visits had become performances of obligation rather than expressions of love, and his attention had become conditional on my compliance with his management of my life. I'm 73 years old, I said, hearing my own voice grow stronger with each word. I've buried a husband, raised a child, managed a household for 50 years. I think I can handle family conflict. Margaret smiled, and it was the first genuine expression of respect I'd received from anyone in months. Then let's get started. I'll need you to sign some documents authorizing me to investigate your financial accounts and request full disclosure of all transactions made under your son's authority. The documents I signed that afternoon felt different from the power of attorney David had rushed me through months earlier. These papers expanded my power rather than diminishing it, created accountability rather than eliminating it, protected my interests rather than someone else's convenience. Walking to my car afterward, I felt lighter than I had since the morning I'd discovered my empty bank account. The woman who'd negotiated with Margaret Chen, who'd asked pointed questions and demanded specific remedies, wasn't the confused elderly victim David had been managing so efficiently. She was the woman I'd been before I'd learned to apologize for taking up space in the world. That evening, I cooked myself a real dinner, chicken with vegetables and rice, prepared with attention and seasoned with herbs from the small garden I'd maintained, despite David's suggestions that yard work was becoming too strenuous for someone my age. I set the table with my good dishes, lit a candle, treated myself with the courtesy I'd been extending to others without reciprocation. The food tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months, not because the ingredients were different, but because I was eating as someone who deserved nourishment, rather than someone grateful for whatever sustenance could be managed with minimal effort and expense. After dinner, I sat in my living room with photo albums I hadn't opened since Robert's death, looking at pictures of the life I'd built through my own decisions and efforts. There I was at David's high school graduation, pride radiating from my face as I applauded his academic achievements. There we were at his college move-in day, my arms loaded with supplies I'd researched and purchased to help him succeed in his new independence. In photo after photo, I saw a woman who'd been actively engaged in creating good outcomes for the people she loved, someone who'd taken initiative rather than waiting for direction, who'd solved problems rather than creating them. That woman hadn't disappeared. She'd simply been convinced to hide while other people made decisions about her life. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. The confusion that had clouded my judgment for months lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight. David's behavior wasn't motivated by concern for my well-being. It was motivated by his own financial benefit and social convenience. His girlfriend's dismissive treatment wasn't protective courtesy. It was calculated exclusion designed to establish hierarchy and boundaries. I'd been grieving the loss of a relationship that had ended long before I'd recognized its absence, mourning a son who'd been replaced by someone who shared his face, but not his heart. The little boy who'd wrapped his arms around my neck after school plays had grown into a man who found my presence embarrassing and my needs inconvenient. But I was still here, still capable, still deserving of respect and dignity and the right to control my own resources and decisions. Margaret Chen had seen that immediately, had responded to my competence rather than my age, had treated me as a client rather than a charity case. Tomorrow would bring phone calls and document requests and the kind of uncomfortable conversations that David had trained me to avoid. But tonight, in my own house at my own table with my own memories spread before me like evidence of a life well lived, I felt ready for whatever battles lay ahead. The woman who'd protected her family's interests for 50 years was finally ready to protect her own. Margaret Chen called on a Wednesday morning while I was watering the tomatoes David had suggested I replace with something less demanding. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd uncovered exactly what she'd expected to find, but worse. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to sit down for this conversation. My investigation into your son's financial management has revealed some concerning discrepancies." I settled into my kitchen chair, the same spot where I'd signed the power of attorney months ago, trusting David's explanations about protecting my interests and ensuring my security. The morning light streaming through my window felt different now, sharper, more focused, illuminating details I'd been too overwhelmed to notice before. "The good news is that your money hasn't disappeared entirely. The concerning news is where it's actually been going." Margaret's voice remained professionally neutral, but I could hear the controlled anger of someone who'd spent years watching vulnerable people get exploited by those they trusted most. "David has been depositing your pension into a joint account that he opened using his power of attorney authority. However, this account has been systematically drained to make payments on his mortgage, his car loan, and what appears to be credit card debt that significantly exceeds what his salary should support." The words hit me like individual physical blows, each revelation adding weight to a growing understanding of how completely I'd been deceived. My pension hadn't been invested for my future security. It had been subsidizing David's lifestyle, funding the comfortable existence he shared with Sarah while telling me I couldn't afford basic necessities. "How much?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Over the past 29 months, approximately $40,000 of your money has been redirected to cover his personal expenses. The savings account he described to you has a current balance of $63. $63. Less money than I'd hidden in the coffee can for emergency household repairs. Less than David probably spent on dinner with Sarah at the expensive restaurants they frequented while I counted pennies for groceries. Mrs. Patterson, there's something else. Based on the pattern of withdrawals and the timing of his mortgage payments, it appears your son has been in serious financial trouble for quite some time. His debt-to-income ratio suggests he's been living well beyond his means, possibly for years before he gained access to your account. The successful young professional who'd lectured me about fiscal responsibility and investment strategies had been drowning in debt, using my modest pension to maintain the illusion of prosperity that impressed his girlfriend and supported their social aspirations. Every time he'd spoken condescendingly about my inability to understand complex financial matters, he'd been spending money I'd earned through decades of careful budgeting and modest living. "What happens now?" I asked, surprised by how calm I sounded when everything inside me felt like breaking glass. "Now we demand full restitution and revoke his financial authority immediately. I've prepared documentation that will freeze his access to your accounts and require him to provide detailed accounting for every dollar he's taken. He has 10 days to respond with either repayment or justification for his actions." After Margaret hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about all the times David had expressed concern for my financial confusion, all the gentle suggestions that I couldn't be trusted to manage money properly. He'd been projecting his own fiscal irresponsibility onto me, using my trust and his perceived expertise to cover his tracks while systematically stealing from someone who'd sacrificed everything to ensure his success. The phone rang again an hour later. David's number appeared on the caller ID, and for the first time in months, I felt no obligation to answer with cheerful availability. I let it ring 4 times before picking up, establishing a small boundary that felt surprisingly powerful. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" His voice carried the usual blend of dutiful concern and subtle condescension, the tone of someone checking on an elderly relative whose needs were predictable and manageable. "I'm fine, David. Actually, I'm better than I've been in quite some time." Something in my voice must have alerted him to a change he hadn't expected, because his next words came more carefully, with the caution of someone sensing a shift in familiar dynamics. "That's great to hear. I was wondering if we could get together this weekend. Sarah and I wanted to talk to you about some options that might make your life easier. Options that might make my life easier." The phrase that had once made me feel cared for now revealed itself as manipulation, a way of framing decisions that served his interests as if they were gifts he was offering for my benefit. "What kind of options, David?" "Well, we've been thinking about your situation. Living alone in that big house, trying to manage everything yourself. There are some really nice senior communities around here where you'd have people your own age, activities, meals provided. Less stress, more social interaction. Senior communities. Places where elderly people went when their families decided they'd become too burdensome for regular life, when their independence became inconvenient for children who had more important priorities." David wasn't suggesting these options out of concern for my happiness. He was preparing to eliminate the last obstacles to his complete control over my finances. "And what would happen to my house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We'd have to sell it, obviously, but the proceeds would more than cover the entrance fee for one of these communities, and the monthly costs would be much less than what you're spending now on utilities and maintenance and all those expenses that add up. The proceeds would more than cover his debts, more accurately. Selling my house, the home I'd lived in for 30 years, the space where I'd raised him, the only financial asset that remained completely under my control, would provide the windfall he needed to escape the consequences of his financial mismanagement." "I'll think about it," I said, knowing he'd interpret my non-committal response as the confused indecision of someone who needed more guidance to make the obviously correct choice. "Don't think too long, Mom. Some of these places have waiting lists, and the really good ones fill up quickly. We wouldn't want you to miss out on the best options because we waited too long to get serious about planning for your future." After we hung up, I walked through my house with different eyes, seeing it not as the burden David had taught me to perceive, but as the asset I'd protected through decades of careful mortgage payments and maintenance investments. Every room held memories of the life I'd built through my own decisions and efforts. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, the living room where I'd helped David with homework, the bedroom where Robert and I had planned our future and grieved our losses. This wasn't just shelter, it was the foundation of my independence, the physical representation of choices I'd made and sacrifices I'd accepted to create stability for my family. David's casual suggestion that I should surrender it for his financial convenience revealed how completely he'd forgotten the woman who'd made his comfortable childhood possible. The letter from Margaret's office arrived the next day, delivered by certified mail that required my signature and couldn't be ignored or delayed. The legal language was formal but unmistakably clear. David had 10 days to provide full accounting of his use of my pension funds or face legal action for financial elder abuse. Financial elder abuse. The phrase gave a name to what I'd been experiencing, transformed my private suffering into a recognized pattern with legal remedies and social support systems. I wasn't a confused old woman being protected by a concerned son. I was a victim of systematic theft disguised as family care. That evening, I called my neighbor Helen, a woman my own age who'd been widowed longer than I had, and who'd maintained her independence through a combination of careful planning and stubborn refusal to be managed by well-meaning relatives. We'd exchanged pleasantries for years, but had never had the kind of conversation that reveals deeper truths about our circumstances. "Helen, can I ask you something? Have your children ever suggested that you might be happier in a senior community?" Her laugh was sharp with recognition. "Every time they visit. Usually right after they notice something that needs fixing around here, or when their own expenses get tight. Amazing how concerned they get about my social isolation whenever they need money." "What do you tell them?" "I tell them I'll move to a nursing home when I can't wipe my own bottom and not a day before. And I remind them that this house will go to whoever's been most helpful when I die, not whoever's been most pushy about relocating me for my own good." Helen's bluntness was refreshing after months of David's subtle manipulations and Sarah's false sympathy. Here was someone who'd recognized the same patterns I was experiencing and had developed strategies for protecting herself without sacrificing family relationships entirely. The trick, Helen continued, is making sure they understand that helping you stay independent serves their interests better than pushing you toward dependence. Nothing motivates adult children like the possibility that their inheritance might go to someone more deserving. That night, I updated my will for the first time since Robert's death, adding specific provisions that would reward loyalty and punish exploitation. The house that David was so eager to sell would go to the community center that had provided me friendship and purpose during my loneliest months, along with a substantial portion of my life insurance benefits. The documents felt powerful in my hands, legal weapons that could defend my interests even after I was no longer able to advocate for myself. For the first time in months, I was planning for a future that extended beyond simply surviving whatever David decided was best for me. Tomorrow would bring his response to Margaret's ultimatum, and I suspected the careful facade he'd maintained for nearly 2 years was about to crumble under the weight of evidence that couldn't be explained away as confused memory or financial misunderstanding. The storm I'd been sensing was finally about to break, and I was ready for whatever truth emerged from the wreckage of lies that had defined my relationship with my son for far too long. David arrived at my house 3 days before Margaret's deadline, his usual confident stride replaced by something more cautious, more uncertain. Sarah wasn't with him this time, the first visit he'd made alone in over a year. Through my front window, I watched him sit in his car for several minutes before approaching my door, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if gathering courage for an unpleasant conversation. When I opened the door, his smile looked strained, artificial, like someone performing a role they no longer believed in. "Hi, Mom. I thought we should talk." "Of course. Come in." I stepped aside, noting how his eyes quickly scanned my living room as if assessing its contents differently than before. Not with the casual dismissal of someone planning improvements, but with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating assets that might soon be beyond his reach. He sat heavily on my sofa, the expensive leather furniture he'd once criticized as outdated and impractical. His designer clothes looked rumpled, his usually perfect hair showing signs of stress-induced neglect. The polished facade he'd maintained for years was beginning to crack, revealing something desperate underneath. "I got a letter from some lawyer," he said without preamble, pulling the certified mail envelope from his jacket pocket. "Margaret Chen. She's making some pretty serious accusations about how I've been handling your finances." I settled into my favorite chair, the one Robert had bought me for my 60th birthday, and waited. The silence stretched between us like a bridge. Neither of us wanted to cross first, weighted with truths that could no longer be avoided or explained away. "Mom, I need you to understand something. I never meant for things to get so complicated. When I took over your accounts, I was just trying to help. You seemed so worried about managing everything yourself, so overwhelmed by all the financial details." His voice carried the pleading tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation, but couldn't quite remember the lines that were supposed to make everything acceptable again. The confident authority he'd wielded for months had evaporated, replaced by the fumbling explanations of someone caught in circumstances he couldn't control or manipulate. "Where is my money, David?" I asked quietly, using the same tone I'd employed when he was 8 years old and I'd found broken dishes hidden in his bedroom closet, hoping denial might somehow undo consequences that were already set in motion. It's been invested, like I told you, in accounts that were supposed to generate better returns than just letting it sit in checking." His words came faster now, tumbling over each other in their haste to fill the uncomfortable silence. "But the market has been volatile, and some of the investments didn't perform the way we expected. Margaret Chen says my money has been paying your mortgage, David, your car payment, your credit card bills." Each word felt heavy in my mouth, weighted with the kind of disappointment that changes relationships permanently. "She says there never were any high-interest savings accounts or complicated investment strategies." His face crumpled like paper in fire, the careful composure he'd maintained for nearly 3 years dissolving under the pressure of accusations that couldn't be deflected with concern for my mental state or confusion about complex financial matters. "Mom, you don't understand how expensive everything is now. Sarah and I were building a life together. We need the house for entertaining clients, for maintaining the kind of image that helps me succeed at work. The car isn't just transportation, it's part of my professional presence. These aren't luxuries, they're investments in our future. Your future, I corrected, paid for with my past. The words hung between us with mathematical precision, accounting for decades of my labor and sacrifice that had been redistributed to fund lifestyle choices I'd never been consulted about. Every dollar I'd saved through careful meal planning and coupon clipping, every small luxury I'd denied myself to ensure David's college education was fully funded, had been converted into mortgage payments on a house I'd never been welcomed into, and car payments on vehicles I'd never been invited to ride in. I was going to pay it back, he said, his voice breaking on words that sounded hollow even to him. Once I got the promotion I've been expecting, once Sarah's career really takes off, we would have been able to return everything with interest. You would never have known the difference. But you didn't get the promotion, did you? The question emerged from some intuitive understanding of the desperation I was witnessing, the kind of calculated risk-taking that comes from people running out of conventional options. That's why you're here now, 3 days before Margaret's deadline. That's why Sarah isn't with you. His silence confirmed what I'd suspected. The financial house of cards he'd built with my money was collapsing under the weight of expectations that reality couldn't support. The lifestyle he'd been maintaining was beyond his actual means, funded entirely through theft disguised as family financial management. The promotion went to someone else, he admitted finally, someone younger, with better connections, fresher ideas. And Sarah's been offered a position in Seattle, a really good opportunity for her career advancement. Seattle, 3,000 miles away from an aging mother whose continued presence in his life had become an inconvenience rather than a blessing. I understood without being told that this geographical solution would solve multiple problems for David, removing himself from the legal consequences of his financial crimes while abandoning responsibility for the woman whose trust he'd violated so systematically. When do you leave? I asked, not because I cared about their timeline, but because I needed to understand how long I had before he disappeared entirely, taking whatever remained of my financial resources with him. We haven't decided anything definite yet. It depends on how some other things work out. His eyes wouldn't meet mine, focusing instead on his hands that twisted together with nervous energy. But Mom, if we do relocate, it would probably be best if you made some changes too. The senior community we looked at has a branch in Seattle. You could be close to us, but with the support services you need. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity, presenting his abandonment as an opportunity for family closeness, framing his theft as preparation for my improved care. Even facing exposure and legal consequences, David continued trying to control the narrative, to position himself as the concerned son making difficult decisions for his confused mother's benefit. I won't be moving anywhere, David. This is my home. I bought it, I've maintained it, and I'll decide what happens to it. My voice carried a strength I hadn't felt in years, the authority of someone who'd remembered her own power. And I won't be funding any more of your lifestyle choices. You don't understand the legal complications if this lawyer gets involved, he said, shifting tactics from manipulation to intimidation. Elder law cases can drag on for years. Legal fees could eat up everything you've saved. Wouldn't it be better to work this out as a family, without involving strangers in our private business? Our private business stopped being private when you started stealing from me. The word stealing landed between us like a physical blow, stripping away the polite euphemisms that had allowed both of us to avoid naming his actions accurately. $40,000, David. Nearly 3 years of my pension, taken without permission and spent on things I'll never benefit from. He flinched as if I'd slapped him, the mathematical reality of his theft apparently more devastating when spoken aloud than when hidden in bank statements and legal documents he'd assumed I'd never examine closely. I never meant to hurt you, he whispered, and for a moment I glimpsed the little boy who'd once cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly, who'd insisted we have a funeral for goldfish that died of old age. I just needed time to get back on my feet, to make everything work the way it was supposed to. You hurt me the moment you decided I didn't deserve the truth about my own money. You hurt me every time you treated me like I was too confused to understand my own financial situation. You hurt me when you chose to steal from your mother rather than ask for help or admit you were struggling. The tears that rolled down his face weren't for my pain, They were for his own circumstances, for the consequences he was finally facing, for the future he'd been planning that was now disappearing along with his access to my financial resources. "What happens now?" he asked, though I suspected he already knew the answer from whatever legal advice he'd sought before coming to see me. "Now you repay what you've stolen, or Margaret Chen takes you to court. Now you face the consequences of treating your mother like a bank account rather than a person." I stood up, feeling taller and stronger than I had in years. "And now, you leave my house, and don't come back until you're ready to have an honest conversation about making amends, rather than making excuses." He left without argument, without the protests or negotiations I'd expected. Through my front window, I watched him sit in his expensive car for a long time, his head in his hands, before finally driving away. The silence he left behind felt different from the loneliness I'd experienced for months. Not empty, but peaceful, filled with the dignity of someone who'd finally stopped accepting unacceptable treatment. That evening, Margaret Chen called with an update that didn't surprise me. "He's requested a meeting to discuss repayment options. His attorney contacted me this afternoon. It appears your son has decided that cooperation might be preferable to litigation. Justice didn't always require courtrooms or judges. Sometimes it was as simple as refusing to enable someone's bad choices, as powerful as demanding accountability from people who'd grown comfortable with exploiting your love. The little boy in the photograph on my mantle would always be part of my heart, but the man who'd stolen from me was finally facing the consequences of forgetting that love had boundaries, and that even mothers deserved respect. 3 months later, I stood in my garden harvesting the last tomatoes of the season, their weight heavy and satisfying in my hands. The plants David had suggested I replace with something less demanding had produced their most abundant crop in years, as if they'd responded to the renewed attention and care I'd finally had energy to give them. The repayment agreement Margaret Chen had negotiated was being honored in monthly installments that arrived with mechanical precision, each deposit accompanied by a brief, formal note from David's attorney confirming the transaction. No personal messages, no attempts to justify or explain, no requests for forgiveness or reconciliation, just the steady return of money that had been taken, dollar by dollar, until my accounts reflected the security I'd earned through decades of careful saving. David and Sarah had moved to Seattle 6 weeks after our confrontation, their departure announced through a brief email that read more like a business memo than a family communication. New jobs, new opportunities, a fresh start in a city where no one knew about financial improprieties or legal complications that had made their current situation uncomfortable. The relief I felt at their absence surprised me with its intensity. I'd spent so many months grieving the loss of a relationship that I'd failed to recognize how much better life became when I stopped trying to maintain connections with people who saw me as an inconvenience rather than a blessing. Helen from next door had become a regular coffee companion. Our weekly conversations ranging from practical matters like winterizing gardens to philosophical discussions about aging with dignity in a society that preferred to warehouse elderly people rather than value their wisdom and experience. She brought a sharp wit and uncompromising independence that inspired me to embrace my own autonomy more fully. "You know what I realized?" Helen said during one of our Tuesday morning visits, stirring honey into her tea with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned to savor small pleasures. "Our children think they're doing us favors by managing our lives, but really they're doing themselves favors by avoiding the guilt of actual engagement." Her words captured something I'd been struggling to articulate about the months I'd spent accepting David's interference as evidence of his care. Real love required effort, presence, genuine interest in my thoughts and feelings and experiences. What David had offered was management disguised as affection, efficiency masquerading as devotion. The church where I'd attended grief counseling had invited me to facilitate a support group for women experiencing financial abuse by family members. The first meeting drew 8 participants, their stories heartbreakingly similar to my own. Adult children who'd gained access to accounts through emergencies or temporary assistance, then gradually assumed complete control while their mothers grew increasingly isolated and financially dependent. "The hardest part," said Maria, a woman whose daughter had been forging her signature on Social Security checks, "is that they make you feel like you're being unreasonable for wanting control over your own money. Like asking questions makes you difficult instead of smart. Each woman nodded with recognition that went beyond words. We'd all experienced the particular cruelty of being made to feel grateful for being robbed, of having our legitimate concerns dismissed as confusion or ingratitude, or the natural paranoia of aging minds. "What helped you fight back?" asked Jennifer, whose son had convinced her to sign over power of attorney, then moved her into a nursing home to gain easier access to her house and savings. "I stopped accepting other people's definitions of what I was capable of handling," I said, remembering the months I'd spent questioning my own perceptions and abilities. I remembered that I'd been managing complicated things successfully long before anyone decided I was too old to understand my own life. The group met monthly in the church basement, our conversations gradually shifting from shared victimization to practical strategies for protection and recovery. Margaret Chen visited as a guest speaker, explaining legal rights and remedies in language that empowered rather than intimidated. A financial advisor from the community center taught basic investment principles and account protection strategies. We became resources for each other, sharing contact information for honest attorneys and reliable repair services, recommending doctors who treated elderly patients with respect rather than condescension, celebrating small victories and supporting each other through setbacks. The loneliness that had defined my life for nearly 3 years dissolved into purposeful connection with people who valued my experience rather than managing my limitations. These women sought my advice about dealing with manipulative relatives, asked for recommendations about financial advisors, invited me to social events where my presence was genuinely welcomed rather than politely tolerated. My house, which David had viewed as a burden requiring constant expensive maintenance, revealed itself as a valuable asset that provided both security and flexibility. The basement apartment I'd forgotten existed became home to a graduate student named Lisa, who needed affordable housing close to the university. Her rent covered my utilities and provided companionship without obligation, someone to check on me during severe weather without assuming responsibility for managing my life. Lisa brought a vitality that reminded me how much I'd missed having young energy in my space. She asked thoughtful questions about the neighborhood's history, genuinely interested in stories about families who'd lived here for generations, businesses that had thrived and faded, community traditions that connected past and present. "Mrs. Patterson," she said one evening while we shared dinner in my kitchen, "would you mind if I brought my boyfriend over sometime? He's studying elder law, and he's really interested in the work you're doing with the support group." The idea that my experiences might be valuable to someone building a career in protecting elderly people felt like redemption, transformation of personal pain into professional purpose. My months of confusion and exploitation had taught me lessons that could help others avoid similar manipulation. The boyfriend, Marcus, was a serious young man who took careful notes during our conversation and asked permission to record my account of David's financial abuse for use in his research about family exploitation patterns. "Your case illustrates several common tactics that adult children use to justify taking control of their parents' resources," he explained. "Understanding these patterns helps us develop better legal protections." My story had become data that might protect other mothers from experiencing the systematic theft and emotional manipulation I'd endured. The shame I'd felt about being deceived transformed into pride about surviving and fighting back, about refusing to accept unacceptable treatment even when it came disguised as loving care. On Christmas morning, I woke in my own bed in my own house, surrounded by gifts from my support group friends, cards from former neighbors who'd moved away but remembered our friendship, flowers from Lisa who'd gone home to visit her family, but wanted me to know I was thought of during the holiday. The silence David's absence had created was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, dignity, self-respect earned through difficult decisions and sustained effort. I'd chosen peace over enabling, boundaries over convenience, truth over comfortable lies that would have required me to diminish myself indefinitely. The phone didn't ring with dutiful holiday calls from Seattle. No awkward conversations where David performed obligation while I pretended gratitude. No careful navigation around topics that might reveal how much better my life had become since he'd stopped managing it for his benefit. I cooked myself a perfect Christmas dinner, setting the table with my finest china, lighting candles that filled the room with warm, golden light. Every bite tasted like freedom, like the particular satisfaction that comes from nourishing yourself exactly as you choose without regard for anyone else's dietary preferences or schedule constraints. That evening, I updated my will again, leaving the bulk of my estate to organizations that supported elderly independence and family abuse prevention. The house would fund emergency assistance for women escaping financial exploitation. The life insurance would endow a legal clinic providing free elder law services. David would inherit enough to acknowledge our biological connection, but not enough to justify the years he'd spent stealing from me, or the months he'd spent planning to institutionalize me for his financial convenience. Some lessons could only be learned through consequences, and some relationships could only be healed through accountability that never arrived. Margaret Chen had taught me that justice didn't always require forgiveness, that protecting yourself wasn't selfish, that love without respect was manipulation disguised as family obligation. Helen had shown me that aging could be empowering rather than diminishing, that independence was a choice rather than a privilege that disappeared with accumulated birthdays. The women in my support group had proved that survival was possible, that recovery was achievable, that community could be created even after trust had been shattered by people who should have protected rather than exploited our vulnerability. On New Year's Eve, I sat in my living room with photo albums open across my coffee table, looking at pictures of the life I'd built through my own choices and efforts. There was 8-year-old David with his arms around my neck, both of us radiating joy that had been authentic in that moment, even if it hadn't lasted forever. But there were other photos, too. Images of the woman I'd been before motherhood, during marriage, after widowhood, and finally, in recent months, as someone who'd remembered her own worth. The thread connecting all these versions of myself wasn't David's approval or anyone else's validation, but my own persistent decision to keep growing, learning, adapting, surviving. At midnight, fireworks burst over the neighborhood where I'd chosen to stay, where I'd fought to remain, where I'd learned that home wasn't just a place but a state of mind that came from honoring your own needs, rather than constantly sacrificing them for people who took your love for granted. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth.